Morning, everyone. My name is Brian Clark. I'm the founder at Ascent, and I am thrilled to be here kicking off Compliance Over Coffee with Peter Dugas, the Executive Director at Capco. What we're doing at Compliance Over Coffee is elevating voices from around the industry, those who work on the lines of defense, first line, second line, third line, about the evolution of risk and compliance. We're going to talk about some interesting topics today, from the regulatory impact of the new administration here in the US to kind of this modern three-pillar view of regulatory frameworks. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for chatting today.
Thanks,
Good to
Brian.
talk again.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
And,
Yeah,
and as always,
cheers.
got my mug ready to go. So cheers. So wanted to start out, we've talked about this concept a little bit before, and obviously risk and compliance is seeing a lot of investment, a lot of interest. It's an area that probably had been underinvested for a number of years and is now getting the credit I think it probably deserves and needs. And we've talked about this in kind of a three-pillar framework. How do you build a strong regulatory framework? And really those three pieces are kind of the content and intelligence, the knowledge of what are the words you have to follow from the laws and regs. Second is the container, which is where do I put that stuff? And then third, which kind of sits over the top and works with both, is the risk advisory and compliance advisory services. And I think as we talked before, you fall in that third category primarily, but just wondering if you agree with that view, what your take is, and how Capco sees those.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think a lot of times what ends up happening, and you've seen this as well, is when we go in conversations to financial institutions to really talk about, how they're going to develop a risk and compliance program. A lot of times, they're sold the technology, but the technology at the end of the day is only assist them with the process. At the end of the day, many times they're challenged with actually having a framework that's effective and efficient in order to make sure that, once they do buy that technology or that content or use someone like an Ascent or even us from a consulting perspective, is they have that framework at the maturity level of the institution. And I think that's been the biggest issue over the last several years we've seen, is them buying a GRC in many instances. And at the end of the day, they fail to be able to implement this effectively, unfortunately.
Yeah, and just to specify, so GRC would fall in that container bucket, right?
Correct. From a technology perspective, it's almost like kind of the hierarchy of where, Ascent fits in and where kind of Capco fits in, because we both have the regulatory data feed on regulatory reporting, but also the consulting as well to help them kind of establish that framework.
Yeah, it's certainly evolving, and one of the things that we hear a little bit about is this concept of integrated risk management, whether it be a GRC or an IRM, and then at the end of the day, you need that advisory, but you need kind of the brain to plug into it. Obviously, that we do here at Ascent, but wanted to get your take on what you're seeing, in the IRM space. Is that a bit of just another buzzword? Is it an actual evolution that you think the industry is going to take on? Obviously, trying to sort through the morass is difficult.
I'm smiling because it's hard to say whether it's a buzzword, but it really depends on how effective the institution is at implementing any sort of risk management program. And whether it's integrated or enterprise risk, whatever the case may be, is really having constant and consistent definitions around the program that they're implementing, consistent taxonomy, understanding how they define risk throughout the institution. I think it's a little bit more about the structure and the framework on how it's consistent through the institution, rather than they define it as enterprise risk or integrated risk. I would say, though, that enterprise risk for many years has been seen something for the larger banks, for the tier one super regional banks, and what we're seeing is that that's definitely not the case anymore. Enterprise risk, no matter whether you're a community bank at 10 billion or you're a large super regional or tier one bank, all of these institutions have to have an enterprise risk management program. It's no longer the day to where they can kind of ignore it and say that's just for larger institutions, not for us.
Yeah, that cascading down has certainly moved quickly, especially in this digital world we're in, right? This remote friendly environment.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think we've talked about in the past that struck me on that is when you say how these ERM programs are moving kind of across the board, right? All sizes of business is the quantification of risk, right? How do I count every risk? Kind of like risk is the new ops. You're just counting everything this time. And so, when we look at how you count compliance risk or regulatory risk, what's
Right.
your view on that? How do you start to get your handle on everything that's out there of what you got to do? Obviously, we do that
Yeah.
as well, but from an implementation, from an advisory standpoint, I'm sure you have a different view, and I'd love your take on that.
Yeah, it's funny. I just had a conversation last week with an institution specifically about this. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the level of risk that the institution is willing to take on. And so what I mean by that, there was a discussion, I would say, around, whether they were a federally chartered institution and whether they needed to comply with state rules. So as a sense, solving for today is many times these institutions may have guidance from FHFA specific to mortgage
Mhm.
origination or requirements. But then when you start to look at the states themselves, they're going to have a different standard or requirement. And we're seeing that in many cases issued through executive orders rather than the traditional regulatory process. So at the end of the day, are they going to cover a New York standard? Are they going to meet a national federal standard? Are they going to, try to do it state by state? And you can kind of see this recently with the Robinhood example. Is the state of Massachusetts went after them specifically for state requirements, not necessarily national. But at the end of the day, those institutions need to determine whether they're going to have an effective standard across the nation and all 50 states that they operate, or is it just going to be a federal standard that they're willing to take on potential litigation because of the fact that they're not complying with those rules?
Yeah, regulatory arbitrage is alive
Yeah,
and well, huh? And
it
it's
is.
interesting with these jurisdictions, in the EU, obviously, I always equate the EU a little bit more towards the Articles of Confederation. And then
Hmm.
obviously our system of federalism is very different, right? But at the end of the day, you've got these tiers of regulation, and you're seeing
Yeah,
that the lowest common denominator is what enforces business activity, right? So if you've got, a couple of rules around privacy that are a bit looser, and then CCPA comes out,
yeah,
everyone goes to the tightest rule because it's what
right.
you have to do to be compliant with all of them. I don't know if you see arbitrage being a key consideration in the industry.
We do. And actually, oddly enough, privacy is a perfect example. I was actually researching the California Privacy Act that was recently passed in November. And,
Mhm.
people are reflecting back on CCPA. Well, guess what? There's already a new standard. And so then the debate becomes, okay, well, what's Congress doing? And Congress has been debating privacy for dozens of years. And you know what's happened? Nothing,
Mhm.
literally nothing. I think many banks were hoping with CCPA that the Senate Banking Committee or the Congress would come together and provide them additional federal balance through that rulemaking process or through legislation specifically, and they haven't, and it's doubtful they will. So now it's how do you operate with the state of California versus where traditionally where your customers are located. And so that's where the other issue becomes,
Right.
is where the customers are
Mhm.
versus necessarily where the institution has retail branch locations.
Right. Yeah, and that just kind of pops you into more and more regulatory regimes, right? So
Yeah.
you may be domiciled in one location and have customers in a couple of states, but because of the way you operate, you end up getting regulated by 30 different agencies. And
Yeah.
we've talked to we've talked to folks who, customers and other folks in the market who are regulated now on a city level, right? And the
Hmm.
city of New York or city of Chicago or city of San Francisco has pretty strict ordinances in
Yeah.
place that is just another layer of regulation. And so, you have this kind of tiered approach that is putting a pretty significant onus on people across the board, let alone if you're
Yeah.
cross border into other countries, right?
Yeah, how have y'all kind of thought about that to kind of solve for that issue? Because I was explaining this to another institution the other day for county level rulemaking. It's actually listed in the newspaper. It wasn't even
Right.
published on the website. So you would typically go to, some county resource and be able to pull the law or regulation that's been updated. No, it's actually published in the newspaper. So, solving for that disparate, system, how's kind of Ascent thinking about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's interesting, I think we're getting to is, and we talk about this internally as well, is what is the widget? What is the thing, right?
Hmm.
And is that a regulatory body? Is it, is that the city? Is it the law from the city, right? So the first thing you have
Yeah.
to do is draw a box around it, right? Like, what is the actual set of content? What is the thing that I'm analyzing? And that's really that first step. Obviously, newspaper publication, I think, dates back to hundreds of years of how
Yeah.
they had to provide notice of public
Correct.
laws, right? And it's
Yeah.
amazing how some of these smaller jurisdictions still are doing it that way, right? And even places that are a bit more advanced.
Hmm.
So I think once you draw the box around it, that first step is getting it digital, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of discussion all over, frankly, all over the world about digitalization of law and regulation. And I
Mhm.
kind of take a separate step from that because my assumption is we can digitalize it. We can digitalize anything in the 21st
Mhm.
century. And then it's how do you use it from there? And I think that ultimately all goes back to how do you draw the box around it,
Yeah.
right? How do you understand the content you're looking at? The, housing rules in San Francisco to the, New York Department of Financial Services, regulations on crypto or
Mhm.
whatever they are, right? And those boxes of knowledge are what allow people to start to chunk away at some of this work. And
Yeah.
then, of course, work with the GRCs, work with folks like yourself to say, what is the bite-sized thing we're going to tackle? And that's when you can start to compare it across. So we look at it very much from how do you quantify these laws and regs, rather than look at it qualitatively, which I think has been the
Mhm.
traditional way it's been done.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the biggest challenge we're seeing right now, is Ascent, Capco, we deliver the content, and then the institution is then challenged with, well, what's next? Is it an obligation? Is it a
Right.
requirement? How do they define that? And we've talked about this before, where each firm defines it a little bit differently, and because it's sometimes the way the lawyer in the general counsel's office is trained, they're going to view it differently, and then you're going to have compliance who may have a different point of view. And I think also it's the way the people are structured within the institution to absorb that information and determine whether there is or is not an impact. And we've seen that's the biggest challenge, because once they start to realize, from Ascent or from Capco, the content that they need to review and analyze, they don't know what to do next because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's kind of lack of standards in the industry.
Yeah.
And I know this is something that a number of regulatory agencies, the FCA recently talked about this, which is, they're more from a definitional standpoint of what is reg
Mhm.
tech and what are the standards
Yeah.
around it. But I think you're hitting on a key point, which is just definitions. Like the industry
Yeah.
doesn't have a set of definitions
No.
that say, some people call horizon scanning change management,
Yeah.
and flip that. Some people call obligations requirements or
Yeah.
inventories. So just getting the right words, meaning the same thing to all the parties, is probably the biggest step that we still need to take in order to facilitate a little bit faster adoption.
Mhm.
I don't know what your take is on that. I thought it was an excellent point, about what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's almost unfortunate, as mature as the legal entities are within the U.S. from both a regulatory and from a legislative process, really we rely upon Europe for many of the standards that we have to implement, because they're further ahead, I would say, in defining and kind of structuring out the reg change or compliance management system process, and the way we kind of look to them to say, okay, eventually in the U.S. we'll kind of get to the same standards that they've kind of already implemented over many years, which I think is kind of sad. But what I'm hopeful
Mhm.
is over the course of the next few years is, with the Biden administration coming in, they'll try to provide some
Mhm.
more definitions and consistency around that, because as you know, they're going to be more integrated with international regulatory agencies than obviously the Trump
Mhm.
administration has been. So hopefully that helps to define a little bit more of how we approach common
Mhm.
definitions and taxonomies that just don't exist.
Yeah. Yeah, that approach, that arbitrage kind of hurt us in a
Mm.
way, if you will, from advancing the industry, because I think there was a bit of, I would say, a laissez-faire approach, right? And I think that was, key to the Trump administration substantive regulatory
Yeah.
policy. And what can still be helpful is the standards that are put in place, and certainly, we've seen a number of digitalized tools that can
Hmm.
started under the Obama administration. Some continue through the Trump administration, some stopped.
Hmm.
But ultimately, that arbitrage started to create value overseas rather than in the U.S.
Yeah.
So what can we do to kind of open up and unlock the use of these technologies that maybe with the new administration coming in,
Hmm.
may help guide the industry forward a little bit? And, you started mentioning,
Yeah.
what you expect from this new administration.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because of what we saw, and I'm sure you saw as well, is a lot of financial institutions kind of sat back a little bit. Compliance and risk management spend probably dropped down to probably 10th or 14th priority on their list. And what I don't think many institutions are going to realize is, with this Biden administration, it's a much different group of people than the President Obama brought in, which is they're much more experienced. They have a lot more of experience within the federal regulatory agencies, and they'll be able to implement things very quickly and very aggressively. historically. And so I think part of that means is two things. One is there's going to be a lot more investment, which I think will help, companies like Ascent and Capco kind of help our firms better comply with the rules and regulation as they're developing. But then also the second part is the prioritization. So rather than the 10th or 14th, priority on the spend within an institution, is probably going to go to number one. And I don't think that'll happen immediately, but I think once they start to recognize, when there's 80 executive orders issued in the first day of the president's term, it's going to be a new day.
Yeah, well, and that is certainly, I think Delta is what drives a lot of adoption in our industry, right? And we're going to see a lot of Delta on at the end of January. So I think, what you were talking about from people who are experienced, who can come in, who can make those changes right away and start to really drive the industry forward. What do you expect from a regulatory innovation side? Like, obviously we've seen the OCC, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, obviously there's the GFIN. There's a number of these organizations that are starting to talk. But how do you see that evolving as they uptake these new practices and investments?
Yeah, good question. I think that's going to be primarily driven by the National Economic Council and the White House. There was a little bit less, I would say, coordination across the federal rulemaking authorities for banking rules and regs specifically under the Trump administration. And I think that'll be likely reversed under this one because they'll have a much stronger policymaking process. And so what I would expect is, they'll drive that through the ones that have done it well. So the SEC is one perfect example of one of the agencies that's done it very well. I mean, but what they've had to do is they were forced to solve for a massive problem, which it's impossible for them to examine thousands of entities when they only have a limited staff. And so technology was the main driver of that, and they've done it very well. FINRA's, done it well. CFTC as well. There's been new leadership there for, the fintech group within the CFTC. So I think that experience will help to drive other agencies, which have taken a little bit step back, like Department of Treasury, likely FinCEN, other agencies like the OCC and FDIC that are building out, a much more sophisticated structure than they have had historically. I don't know if you've seen recently, but the FDIC, when the rulemaking process was trying to get comments more so about the record keeping process, because just the overly burdensome requirement of record keeping specific to the FDIC, they're trying to adopt and understand what the industry's needs are as far as like better layering of information that can be easily reported to the FDIC, because as it is now, it's very disparate. Very disparate. And so it creates a lot of challenges for both the FDIC to collect it, as well as the institution to collect it and report it.
Yep. Yeah, this concept, I think of arbitrage is probably present across agencies in addition to across jurisdictions, right? And to your point on record keeping, we look at the data that we produce of these obligations across different agencies, and the systems, you could see record keeping for 15 different agencies, and they all have different standards. And there's all, you can we create kind of an objective truth of these obligations, but the qualitative and substantive requirements of each of those is different. And so they're trying to harmonize across as much as, each other as much as they are across different jurisdictions. So yeah, the arbitrage is real, and it's costing a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the upcoming legislation just passed by Congress, another stimulus bill, if you look at the definition of a small business, there is no agency that defines it the same. So SBA has their own definition, U.S. Department of Agriculture, all these agencies have their own definitions. Some of that's driven by historical legislation that authorizes the department or agency, but sometimes, to your point, if they don't really talk, they don't communicate effectively, and because of that, their own definitions causes, compliance burden, which unfortunately, even with technology and our capabilities, is challenging. I don't know if you've seen a lot of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have, a set of rules or requirements and you have different taxonomies, right, it's going to create thrash. And it's kind of like having 3 leaders in a business say 3 different things. Everyone's going to be confused downstream and trying to sort it out. And so without that alignment, you're going to have that sort of confusion. And the problem in this case, especially, is that the downstream confusion results in a ton of waste, a ton of productivity loss, a ton of inefficiency, where people generally, and I don't know if you've seen this, people generally want to follow the rules. They want to do the right thing. But when those standards are unclear, when there's no common definitions, when you're just trying to figure out the upstream piece, it's really hard to get to that downstream. How do we follow it? How do we do it? And I think that the more clarity, to your point, they give our own definitions and standards across, and we see this sort of, and I hate to use the word taxonomy because I think it's
Yeah.
overused, but
Yeah.
we see this, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. I think Australia's done a really nice job, or a better job, I should say, of that. And I think that, the EU has tried. I think that not for want of effort,
Right.
sometimes a bit difficult. But we see periodically these jurisdictions doing that. I think the U.S. probably has a little way to go. If you're thinking about regulation as a competitive advantage, it's not necessarily, but the standardization of it can certainly give all of us a lot more certainty.
Do you do that internally as well? Try to standardize the data and information you're kind of pulling in to almost help the institution when they haven't even defined it? So in other words, trying to give them a model or best practice or kind of standardization across the way Ascent kind of reports it, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think objectivity and standardization is key, right? Anytime you want to build a process, that's going to be very, very important for the standardization. When you look at the way the data comes out, without an objective truth, you can't automate and you can't build proper, AI machine learning algorithms. And so setting that process and setting those standards are key. And we've done that with industry experts. As you know, we've talked quite a bit, but we've set that objective truth internally as an anchor point. And anytime you're going to automate, I think that's an important piece. So we do that. And it does materially help people figure out where we fit in their kind of end-to-end compliance process. But I think to your point earlier, where people end that process is different. Right?
Yeah.
Where, counsel comes in, where advisory comes in, where audit comes in, where the different lines of defense kind of jump in and out of that process is very different. So I would say it's not necessarily something that's set in stone from an industry standpoint, but we have, obviously made a lot of inroads in setting that objectivity taxonomy.
So where do you fit? And typically in that discussion, actually, I'd like to take that a little bit step further. So if you're having a discussion, general counsel brings you in, or maybe it's compliance or risk management, or whoever in the institution, how do you kind of establish that discussion so they have a common set of I would say standards that you're trying to map to? Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have sometimes is the lack of consistency within an institution on how and what they really want or need. And in fact, it continually changes sometimes. So how do y'all approach that?
And I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's an excellent point, right? Like you'll have a different view than the client, than someone else, than multiple people at the same client site, right? So I always say risk, compliance, and audit do the same thing. Risk looks at it before it happens, compliance looking at it while it happens, and audit looks at it after it happened.
Yeah.
And that lens, if you will, is kind of the internal lens. When we look at that three pillars, going back to what we started talking about, we are building all that objectivity for those use cases into the standardized data that we push into a GRC or an IRM. And then we look at advisory as kind of sitting over the top. And obviously folks like yourself who can kind of shepherd that information and the systems together and then provide counsel or advice or consulting on how to do all that, what to do, how to comply. But I think those things have to work together. So we do see a bit more standardization coming out. And I can kind of boil this down into 3 points. The first is, I think, the collection of information is that first point, just having a data dump of everything. And I think we saw a lot of solutions in the industry try to do that over the last couple of years. And from customers directly, what we've heard is, that solution by itself doesn't do a whole lot. You really have to marry it with more intelligence around this content. And so what we're seeing evolve is this idea of an obligation or requirement that is directly from the text. Now, when we run our data, we find it's about 35% of any law or regulation in a rules-based jurisdiction creates these affirmative obligations, things you can be sued for, things you can be prosecuted for by the DOJ or by an administrative agency. So we are seeing it start to standardize across large institutions, smaller institutions, not as much yet. But this idea of what are my requirements? What do I have to do? I think is always in the back of people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest challenge where we've seen is have their federal framework kind of established, but then when they start looking at laws and regs within the states on certain definitions, let's say around, let's say privacy would be an example, or debt collection would be an example, having them to have a consistent definition around those and understanding what the obligations are, because to your earlier point is, okay, maybe they're operating in 30 states, but they have customers in all 50 states. So is the obligation specific to all 50, or do they only worry about the 30 where they're operating? And I think that's where the first issue becomes is, how they define that framework. And then the second one is actually going into the law or regulation to ensure that they understand what those obligations are within the state, and then setting up a framework to actually comply with those. It's daunting for sure.
It absolutely. And to your point, what we've seen is, obviously you get to those obligations from the regulatory texts. Some people call this inventories, but that objective truth of like, what do you have to follow to stay compliant? And then we see folks kind of sit on top of that and maybe configure that, provide advice or counsel with that set of data, and ultimately map that to their controls, right? And that's that connection for how you can create that end-to-end process. And I think the whole industry is generally recognized that's the way we're going. And we hear that over and over. I think there's some kinks to work out, but we are seeing a trend in that direction, and hopefully, just kind of circling back to where we were, we can get the regulatory agencies on board with this idea where you need people in advisory, you need these systems, and you need these knowledge sets, this data that can actually drive this forward. Because without that, you're going to be missing one of those pillars. You're going to be in bad shape.
Yeah, it's funny, as we're discussing this, at the end of the day, my hope is with the new administration that someone like the American Bankers Association or SIFMA comes in and starts to help to drive that common theme and that common issue set for their members. Because, at the end of the day, if you don't have kind of a nonpartisan entity that's kind of driving, the public policy making around that, there's going to be a skewed view on, how the standardization can occur. But unfortunately, so far, we're surprisingly haven't really seen that be like a top issue or top policy making process by really any entity. Unfortunately, we're hopeful though. We're hopeful.
Yeah, it is a very 21st century problem to look at data standardization, taxonomy, and kind of protocol as a top issue. But I think the reality is that it is. Without those, that again we were talking about before, that thrash will continue. You can't solve a problem from the bottom up that requires top-down coordination. And certainly the direction I think that will be helpful for all of us. I want to switch gears based on something you just said. Obviously, the new administration coming in. I think we only have a couple minutes left. Sure. But wanted to ask, what's your view on 2021? What are you most looking forward to in our space? What do you anticipate happening? What are you afraid of, and what are you looking forward to?
Yeah, what I keep telling people is what's old is new. I mean, if we really look back at the standards that were established by President Obama and his team from financial regulation, it's going to go likely 100% back to exactly their approach, which is a much stricter view of compliance. A good example is the CFPB. We would definitely see fair lending is going to be a number one top priority for this administration, especially given the concerns they have over the previous 4 years. And, then you start to kind of move into what's emerging, and you start to look at ESG investing. Obviously, going back to the discussion around Europe, they're well ahead of where we are in that entire process, both defining it as well as implementing standards. And so I would expect that to be a priority. Climate change is another major issue that's not, again, well defined by federal regulatory agencies. In fact, it's only really the SEC that's somewhat given some level of guidance, and it's really only something that is going to be something that is greatly going to affect the financial situation of an institution. So again, climate change is going to be one of those issues. And I would say also, looking back at kind of the various issues from debt collection to privacy to a lot of different topics that, we looked at President Obama and his administration, is going to be very similar. And, going back to civil rights issues, another topic that is not well defined in our industry, but is likely to be a priority for this administration. And, how they approach regulation around that is going to be something that's not been standardized. Speaking of standards.
Yeah, it does certainly present an opportunity to kind of structure and standardize the rule of law in ways that may have led to, I think, a bit of softness in the enforcement. And as they structure and standardize these things in a better way, hopefully provides clarity to all and the right outcomes that I think a lot of folks are looking for. But there you have it, folks. What's old is new. We're coming back to 2010. We're going
Yeah,
back 10 years, and we're there again.
yeah,
But
exactly.
hopefully with better technology and the ability to work from home. Um, so excellent. Well, Peter, always a pleasure to catch up, and really appreciate you taking the time. And hope you have a great holiday.
Yeah, same to you, Brian, and same to everyone at Ascent.